The dream of my youth partially came true. Unfortunately, I did not become a pilot, but I passed the whole cycle of training for a gunner radiator. At the beginning of 1941, my training comrades were distributed to the front units of the Air Force, and I was detained in the flight school to work as an instructor. It was a shame. One day an acquaintance came to visit us. After a 2-month stay on the Eastern Front, he proudly showed a scar from a wound and the First Order. How could I leave my instructor job and go to fight at the front? Most of the young men at that time thought exactly like that. Already in the first days of service, I submitted a report on my acceptance as an officer. I finished the special courses with success. I'm still 20 years old, and I'm already a paramedic. The next promotion will take me into the world of officers. I'd like to wear the epaulettes of a lieutenant, but according to the current rules, it is impossible without at least a temporary stay at the front. However, the way out of the situation found itself. The commander of the flight school must send me to the front, thanks to the rules. Departure to the Eastern Front was scheduled for June 1st, 1943. I read the assignment documents and I wanted to fall through the ground. I was appointed commander of a communications platoon, which is equivalent to the head of a stationary radio station of one military airfield. What orders can we talk about in such a place? How can one become a hero in such a case? How can one compare oneself to one's father, a World War I invalid? I was overcome with excitement and despair. Let the reader believe that I am not lying, and despite the terrible losses of the winter of 1942 to 1943, I still believed in the final victory of the Führer. 2 of us went to the east. 2 future officers to smell the powder went by train to Krakow, where, according to the experienced companion, there was an airfield for supplying air units with new airplanes and spare parts. From there you can fly to the front. For this purpose we leave the train and stand at the streetcar stop. I have a lot of luggage, a backpack, a large special bag of flight personnel, a rifle, gas mask, helmet and briefcase. It's a heavy load. When the streetcar approaches, I quickly start packing, and oh horror! The briefcase has disappeared, and with it all the documents, including the assignment order. All that's left is my ID card. This is fate making itself known. Because of this, I got a lot of problems with the head of counterintelligence airfield. There'd be an investigation, and my promotion to lieutenant would be pushed back. I had to write a new, temporary appointment order. The major asks, do you even know who and where you are assigned? A whirlwind of thoughts swirls in my head, and a decision is made in an instant. The squadron, in which my elder brother serves, is located near Stalino. It would be a gunner radiator and get there. I said, I know. As a gunner radiator in the first group of bomber squadron, no. 100 in Stalino. I lied to him, and thus influenced the course of fate. Then I received my orders and went on. At the Krakow airfield we saw a large number of airplanes of many different types, as well as flight personnel. Our target was some higher headquarters located near Dnipro. Not without difficulty we managed to book seats in a transport plane for the next day. Having a lot of free time till the next morning, we were walking along the edge of the airfield. Suddenly a man in a flight suit shouts in our direction, Klaus, "Is that you, Dankwart? Where did you come from?" Turns out to be a neighbor from the school bench. Unbelievable, but possible. He's a member of a special unit of the Air Force whose job it is to supply the frontline squadrons with new equipment. They fly all over Europe. At the same time, not forgetting about themselves, they buy deficits and then sell them among themselves, matches and lighters from Germany to Ukraine, moonshine and sunflower oil from Ukraine to Norway, canned fish from Norway to Germany, etc. etc. Of course, such transactions are practiced not without profit. Their wallets are literally bursting with the assignments of all German-occupied countries. My classmate and his merry company invite us to visit a military casino in Krakow. We say that we have no money, but the invitation, it turns out, is designed for a free evening for us. The evening was spent with thorough drinking, after which we barely made it back to the airfield and overslept in the morning. When we ran up to the dispatcher, he announced to us that our seats were occupied by others who wanted them and we would have to wait. Meanwhile, the airplane is approaching the runway, the engines roared, the heavy bird accelerates and quickly pulls away from the ground. We look with interest at the impressive takeoff of the winged machine. Suddenly the timbre of the noise of the engines changed, one of them stalled. The airplane turns sideways, its nose crashes into the ground, and in a flash the flame shoots out of the engine. A merry-go-round of rescue measures, which are described in the regulations on technical safety at military airfields, is started. We have nothing to do. In an hour we learn so many dead, so many more or less maimed. No casualties at all. And us? We stand there and realize that once again fate has intervened in our affairs. The guardian angels have acted in time. Do not forget about this case, dear reader, when you read the chapter about the meeting with the gypsy fortune teller. The weather has turned bad, flights to the east have been cancelled. We sit here for 2 more days, until one of the pilots offers me to take the place of a gunner radiator in his 2-seat plane, a dive bomber Junkers 87. Agreeing, I bid farewell to my travelling companion and flew away. The first landing was to take place in Lvov. Sitting facing the tailplane, I admire the view, carelessly enjoying the pleasant feeling of 3-dimensional motion, completely surrendering to the joyful thought that I was flying. About an hour passed. Suddenly, on the helmet phone, the pilot asks, "Do you know where we are?" Of course I don't know, I don't have a map and no one appointed me navigator. That's the trouble. But we can see railroad tracks and stations below. We cross the railroad lines and approach a medium-sized city, whose citadel shows traces of heavy artillery shelling. From the pilot's duffel bag on his instructions I take out binoculars, the plane goes down, and I manage to determine the name of the station, written in black paint on the white wall. Now it is possible to fly over the railroad to Lvov. Suddenly something alarmed me. The picture behind the tail of the airplane changed almost imperceptibly. A white streak appeared, the source of which was obviously in the engine. I inform the pilot, he nods his head and points to the lubrication system thermometer. The arrow is above the red marking. The cooling system of the lubrication circuit has failed. Thank God. Lvov airfield is close. We made it. The pilot made a landing with the engine already inoperative, and the smoke streak behind the plane changed color into dark brown. The airplane comes to a stop, and the pilot yells, "Get off quickly. It's going to catch fire, you bastard." We managed to save all the luggage and ourselves without damage, and the fire department is trying to save the airplane itself. The question is, what exactly is fate trying to bring to my consciousness? But I try not to think about it, the worm of heroism still gnaws at me. I went to save the fatherland. If I can be stopped by the first difficulties, what honor can we talk about? I went further by train and in a couple of days arrived not in Dneprodzerzhinsk, but in Dnepropetrovsk. With small steps I am approaching Stalino, where the appearance of the younger brother should be a surprise for the older one. On a small courier plane I flew to Stalino on June 11th, 1943, went on foot to the military town and the first living being I met on the way was my elder brother. I can't forget the expression on his face when he recognized me. Instead of a cheerful greeting, I heard information about the superstition of pilots. "Don't you know that 2 brothers in one flying unit means death to one of them?" I said, and he puts his arm around me, greeting me. "Quick, forget I said that. We'll get you settled somehow." The assignment order upset his brother. He hoped that the youngest would stay in the rear, on the ground. He did not know how I was rushing to honor and glory. There's a shortage of radio operators in the unit. They don't give me a rest from a long trip. I settled down in a military town, got acquainted with the bomber's radio, studied the front rules of radio communication, and on June 13th a call to prepare a night raid on an oil refinery near Saratov. The flight went well. 3 times searchlights caught us, and 3 times the pilot managed to jump out of the dangerous tunnel of blinding light. We returned to the airfield and went to bed around 4 a.m. I hadn't forgotten about my brother's birthday on June 14th. As I got up and had breakfast, I went to the neighbouring building, where my brother lived, a captain and squadron commander. I was surprised in front of the door of my brother's room. A field officer was hammering nails with a hammer. "What are you doing?" I ask. And he stammers, "You see, if someone from the raid doesn't return, it's a regulation to hammer the door and put a seal on it." But I heard they kept in radio contact until they were forced to land in the steppe between the Don and the Volga. They must be alive. What did I do? Killed my brother by my appearance in his unit. It can't and shouldn't be like that. I appealed to the commander of the group major with a request to inform me about my brother's chances of returning alive. He comforts me that they will search at night and organize a landing in the steppe, if only they find them. In the evening begins my second combat sortie. Again we return without the slightest damage to the airplane. I learn that the scouts did not find the crew of the downed plane. But one of the combat bombers reports that they saw a missile with the code of last night, dropped down, and saw all 4 people hit crew on their feet, threw bags with supplies, but could not land with bombs under the belly and 3,000 litres of fuel in the tanks. The next night the search was repeated. 3 airplanes without cargo try to find the crew, but I am not allowed to raid, given my state of mind. I stay at the radio station, sitting with headphones, trying to catch the softest call, but on the frequency band of our squadron complete silence. A special code was agreed upon. 888 crew found and rescued. 111 we stopped the search with no result. But here, about 10 minutes after the estimated time, hears the call of one of our aircraft. I answer. Another call, it means that they do not hear us. Another call, and the continuation of 888, and that's it. Everyone who followed the transmission shouting hurrah, saved, and I take off my headphones, ask a comrade to replace me and run to the airfield 2 kilometers from the radio station. The duration of the flight from the rescue site to us is at least an hour and a half, but I want to be there when the plane lands and be the first to hug my brother. The moment the wheels of the airplane touch the runway, the entire flight and non-flight personnel gathered. The time is 2 hours and 30 minutes. The bomber is approaching, the engines stop, and the first to get out of the hatch is my brother. I rush there to greet him and congratulate him on his rescue, but someone grabs me by the sleeve. "Are you crazy, or what? Observe discipline." The commander should be the first to do it. I was dumbfounded. Is the mental suffering of my own brother in such a situation irrelevant? It hurt to the point of tears. I performed the ritual of reporting on the operation without any emotions. Waiting it seems like an eternity. I make my way to my brother, hug him, and can't hold back the sobs. I will never forget my brother's words. "Hang in there, kid." Soldier style, someone serves glasses of champagne. We clink glasses and drink. From that moment I never saw my brother again. A party was arranged in honor of the rescued and rescuers, but separately by rank. Brother in the officers' casino, I with non-commissioned officers in the mess hall. The drinking is terrible, with no distinction between people of one level or another. Many people approach me with an offer to chug and drink, so the end of the fun is lost to me in a fog. It took me 2 days to be treated for alcohol poisoning. Fate, what are you doing to me? Again in the evening, the preparation of another raid. 1 squadron to mine the Volga, 2 squadrons to bomb ships on the Caspian Sea. My brother flashes me that he attached me to the mine-sweeping crew. There are few anti-aircraft guns there, no night fighters at all. You should adapt to the conditions of night flights. Suddenly the commander of the group, a major, came up to me. "I want to check what kind of gunner radiator you are." "Join my crew where to?" "To the Caspian Sea, of course. On the last night his radio operator was badly wounded by shrapnel from an anti-aircraft shell." The night is quiet, no wind, no clouds. The flight through the mouth of the Mias and Menik to the Volga Delta is quiet. There is no anti-aircraft fire, no fighters. But we must be careful. American Aerocobras R-39 are flying here. And for their better orientation, fires are lit on the ground during our flight in the direction of movement. We are approaching the Volga Delta, where, according to scouts, there are a good 100 floating objects on the roadstead, which must be destroyed. The commander and I are the first to fly into the target zone at an altitude of 1,000 meters. Immediately begins the frequent firing of anti-aircraft guns, and the commander gives the order to stop the raid to avoid unnecessary risk. The moon illuminates the sea, and on its shiny surface is clearly visible to any ship. We leave the danger zone. We see a large tonnage vessel below. We make a circle, trying to determine the deck armament. They're not firing. Down, shaving flight commander orders. It is not destined to float long. Everything else passes before my eyes like a movie, which I watch from the viewer's seat. We go into a dive and I hear the commander shout, "I didn't switch the fuse." The bomb didn't explode, and at the same moment the anti-aircraft fire starts again. We feel a strong blow, feel pain in my leg, the right engine fails. Various measures are taken to stabilize single-engine flight, but without success. Attention. Landing on water informs the pilot. The noise of contact with the water and silence. The airplane is floating. There is time to eject and inflate the rubber boat. All 4 crew members take seats in it, each with a bag of emergency supplies, besides 4 automatic rifles, a flare gun with rockets, an emergency radio transmitter, a mast, a sail, and a medical kit. The usable area of the boat is small, and with such a load there is no room for people. So we sit on board, one foot on a pile of rescue materials, the other in the water. We look for oars, and it turns out we don't have one. So we row 2 rowers ahead on the left and right, and the third to keep the course. Landing and accommodation finished safely in a matter of minutes. The still floating airplane begins to sink. The tail rises out of the water, and slowly, with gurgling sounds, our proud eagle disappears under the water. Words to describe the feelings that came over me at that moment are very difficult. Above us is a gigantic sky, merging through an imperceptible boundary with the surface of the sea. The bright stars seem to be within arm's reach. There is not the slightest movement in the air. The sea is as smooth as a mirror, and we are the center of the universe. Absolute silence reigns, such silence that I am not worried about anything. The state is quite unnatural, the soul is still flying, and there is calmness in me instead of fear. Sitting helmsman aft, I turn back and see the beginning of a grand play of colors. We're heading west by compass. The shore must be near. We will surely reach it, and they will send us an airplane and rescue us like a brother. Today is June 20th. The sun rises early. Visibility on the sea should be very good, and here the eastern horizon begins to be outlined by a dark purple stripe. The colors change minute by minute. The purple hue moves upward, and the horizon glows with ever brighter colors from maroon to orange. Finally, upward white lightning begins to strike where the sun is about to appear. At the same time, the sky to the west is still black, and the whole palette of colors from dark purple to dazzling white is slowly reclaiming space from the night. Drunk from this unforgettable picture, I try to draw the attention of my comrades to the extraordinary phenomenon of nature. But their reply cools my thoughts. Are you crazy? How can you admire the sunrise when death is near? What death? I think. Won't we be saved? My reflections were far from reality. Everything that had happened seemed like a dream. The sun has risen, trying to determine the speed of our boat. The result is disappointing, about 2 kilometers per hour. Sail is no good, as there is not the slightest wind. And how many kilometers from the western shore of the Caspian Sea we are? Even the commander has no idea. We start sending SOAS on the international sea distress frequency of 500 kHz. I, as a radio operator, warn that the Russians are listening to this band no less attentively than ours, but the commander does not pay attention to it. I am surprised because it is fraught with the fact that we will be detected by Russian ships, if there are any nearby. 3 hours later we hear a diesel engine knocking from afar, and soon after that the noise of engines comes from all sides. We think it's fishermen, having had a good night's sleep and catching fish. There are no boats in sight, and we keep paddling. Eventually, around noon, a rather large fishing boat approaches. On it is a crowd of men, each with a machine gun and rifle in his hands. Among us are 3 field officers. We know that the Russians do not take prisoners. They torture and then kill unarmed opponents. We each have a pistol, and killing yourself is a simple matter. I'd rather commit suicide than fall into the hands of these beasts. The pistols have already been taken out, but the Major says I know that the Russians fulfill the provisions of the Geneva Regulations on land warfare with regard to prisoners. We can hope for human treatment. My faith in my established ideological beliefs crumbles in me. We, field officers and privates, are presented with the enemy as a brutal and cruel creature, while staff officers are exposed to the truth about the treatment of prisoners. There is no time to occupy ourselves with this thought, but ruins remain ruins. We throw machine guns and pistols into the water, waiting for the coming events. The pilot turns to the commander. "Wouldn't it be better, Mr. Major, to remove and throw away the Knight's Cross?" He replies, "I fought in the war and did not allow any crimes. My conscience is clear. I see no reason to be afraid." He must have known that staff officers live in special camps, where even the food is better than that of the rank and file. He also knew that at the surrender of the 6th Army in Stalingrad, the staff officers were left with orders. He also knew that Nazi propaganda lied to the common people. From the boat begin to shoot. Bullets whistle over our heads. Not far from the side of the boat, fountains rise. We raise our hands in the air. When the boat comes close, we climb the ladder to the deck. Unarmed, we stand surrounded by grim faces and barrels of firearms. People are talking, shouting, someone threatening with a fist. All around are faces with Mongolian cut eyes that inspire fear and disgust in US Central Europeans. They take away everyone's wristwatch and the commander's Knight's Cross. None of us understand a word of Russian, but there can be no doubt that we are forced to strip down to our underwear. The commander tries to protest, but he is still not understood. They bring ropes, hands behind our backs, and tie us up professionally. For the first time I understand the first Russian word, "come on." They escort us to the post cabin. We go downstairs, sit on a bench in a tiny room. I'm in a state of shock. I can't make sense of this whirlwind of events. The ropes are tightened so tightly that my hands quickly go numb. An old man with a rifle is seated upstairs at the entrance to the cabin. With body movements and grimaces we try to show him that we are in pain. He understands, calls the others, and we do get the ropes loosened. After an hour, 2 men with sticks show up and start beating us. I sit first near the ladder and take a good dozen blows to my arms, shoulders and head. The only saving grace is that the cabin is small, and there's no room for them to swing. They move on to the mechanic, then the pilot, and finally break the sticks on the commander's body. All 4 of us are covered in blood, but the commander got hit the most. Both percussionists smell of alcohol. After a while the executioners return, and the procedure is repeated. The commander is barely alive. He obviously has fractures in his arms and skull. He rises, rushes up the stairs without a word. The terrified janitor lowers the muzzle of his rifle and fires. The bullet shatters his right femur. The commander's body falls. A pool of blood spills over the floor. They come and look and tie our legs with extra ropes. The commander lies unconscious all night, and when it dawned, we saw that he was dead. The funeral takes place before our eyes. The corpse is unceremoniously thrown overboard. That night and that moment bring me back to the real world, shivering with fear, freezing in the heat of the Caspian summer. Would my life, too, end under such hurtful conditions? I wanted to fight for the honor and glory of the motherland, to earn awards, orders and promotions, to attract the eyes of surrounding compatriots. To die? Yes, if I'm destined, but to die only in battle. And what is the prospect now? To die like cattle, on the dirty floor, beaten, helpless. The fear was not of death, but of this kind of departure from this world. We are hungry and thirsty, and we make it clear. A bucket on a rope is used to draw water and give us a drink. The pilot warns about high salt content in the Caspian water. But the taste of water is not salty. We are already in the stream of fresh water of the Volga estuary. We are not given anything to eat. By the evening we dock at the wharf. We are still sitting with bound hands and legs. A whole armada of mosquitoes descends on us. They enjoy German blood, and we have no means of defense. The whole surface of the body is provided to feed these bloodthirsty insects. They get into our ears and nose, leaving tumors of great size. To alleviate our suffering, we start dancing around, rubbing body against body. When it dawns, we can't recognize each other. Our faces are distorted with giant blisters. Our whole bodies itch. We sail up the river again, approaching Astrakhan. 3 fishermen appear in the door. I am the first to be freed from the ropes. They return my pants and jacket, tell me to put them on and tie me up again. The pilot and the mechanic go through the same procedure. The boat docks at the Astrakhan pier and they take us to the shore. A group of military men is waiting for us there. Their uniforms are black, and this color inspires fear in me. The captain reports to the officer, and this moment is fixed in my memory like a stone bas-relief. I see how the naval officer, with a lightning movement of his fist, gives a punch to the captain of the boat. The blow was professional. He rises with difficulty. The sailor says something to those standing nearby, and they untie us. And there's one more thing that officer does. He takes a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket and offers a smoke. From that moment, June 22nd, 1943, from 11:30 a.m., I became a smoker for exactly 50 years. Oh, fate, what are you doing to me? For explanation, it is necessary to tell about what we learned later in that area of the Caspian Sea, where we were hunting for warships. Fishermen from Kalmykia were working. There were floating fish processing bases anchored at sea, where mostly women worked. Many of them lived on the base together with their children. From an altitude of 1,000 meters at night, it is difficult to distinguish a warship from a floating base. As a result, one of the bases was sunk by a bomb the previous night. Many women and children died, and we were taken prisoner by relatives of the dead. You can understand them. In Germany, there were cases of murder of crews of American and British bombers. They were killed by the victims of the bombs they dropped. We, 3 of the 4 of us, were still alive. Later we learned from the stories of political officer Meyer that the captain of the boat was put on trial for the murder of a very important commander of the German Air Force, valuable language, as they said at the time, and the officer who received us was reprimanded for manhandling. He allegedly could not contain himself at the sight of prisoners with clear signs of physical abuse. With a letter from Oleg Alexandrovich Kuznetsov, a resident of the city of Saratov, September 14, 1998, I received an extract from the book by U.A. Pantalayev, Half a Century at the Front, publishing house, Military Memoirs, the following content. On the same night of June 19th, we learned from our neighbors, sailors of the Caspian flotilla, that the Nazis bombed Astrakhan, set fire to the oil barge and floating fish factory. The submarine Lenin, reflecting the raid, hit a Nazi bomber. The crew landed on the water and tried to escape on an inflatable boat. A fishing motorboat passing by took the Germans prisoner. Among them was Major Klaas, commander of a destroyer squadron operating on the Volga. He was a hardened fascist. His chest was decorated with 4 iron crosses. He behaved violently. The fishermen had to deal with him. In the fight, Klaas was killed. He had with him a map with all the flight routes to the Volga. It was an important document for us. We congratulated our neighbors on their good luck. I can't help but make corrections to this document. The first raid on Astrakhan took place on June 23rd, when we were already there in captivity. The oil barge and the floating fish factory were sunk on the open sea really on the night of June 19th, but we were hit not by a canal boat, but by a cargo steamer on the night of June 20th. There was no award of 4 Iron Crosses in the German army. And how violent Klaus was, the respected reader could be convinced by the statement of an eyewitness. I can vouch for the fact that Klaus had no map, because all documents, including maps, we managed to destroy before capture. Apparently not all historians are well informed. I consider the best historians to be eyewitnesses. Sometime in 1947 I met an engineer at the chemical plant where I was working at that time. At the beginning of the conversation there was always a question when and where he was taken prisoner. It turned out that in June 1943 he escaped disaster only thanks to the lack of attention of our commander. He tells us, "I sailed as a passenger on a cargo steamer from the Persian port to Astrakhan. At night on June 20th about midnight raised the alarm. The Germans are raiding. The steamer had a decent number of anti-aircraft guns of different calibers. The gun crews were preparing to fire at the approaching bomber. They were under the command of some young inexperienced lieutenant, who was about to give the order to do so. But then a major appeared, also a passenger, but obviously an experienced front-line soldier. He shouted that everyone should listen only to his commands, and with the muzzle of a naggin he convinced the lieutenant that he was taking over the position of commander. He ordered the anti-aircraft guns to turn their guns towards the moon, so the Krauts could see the steamer only against the moon, and after dropping the bombs the silhouette of the flying machine should be visible against it. This he risked a lot, but it was also the only chance to hit the bomber. And so he did. The bomb did not explode, and anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the clearly visible silhouette of the plane. As if they didn't hit it, but the plane didn't come back either. Only 2 days later we learned that the Heinkel 111 bomber had been shot down that night and the crew taken prisoner. That sounds very much like your story, doesn't it? The name of the steamer was the Meridian. It's highly probable that the engineer actually witnessed the victory of the steamer's anti-aircraft guns over the night bomber. While sailing down the Volga, we, guessing about the interrogations, had time to agree on how we would explain our origin. We could have been separated, so there should not be different testimonies. We made up a story that we were supposedly the crew of a long-range scout who had flown from Kerch to investigate steamship traffic on the Caspian Sea. The pilot knew the number of the unit and the name of the commander, so the explanations looked plausible to all 3 of us. After an unexpectedly kind reception in the port of Astrakhan, we were put into a Black Z's, a luxurious 8-seater limousine in the back seat. In front of us were 2 sailors with automatic rifles, and in front the chauffeur and our patron, a naval officer. We drove for a short time and stopped, as we found out later, in front of the commandant's office of the Caspian Fleet. As we thought we were placed in different rooms. And how spacious 6x6 meters. There is a sofa, a table, chairs, big windows overlooking the port. I look, sit, lie down, and so on for several hours. A sailor with a machine gun appears and with a movement of his head explains where to go. I read a lot about the terrible events that took place in Russia under communist rule. Communist in my concept is a murderer, a cruel and ferocious man with brutal morals, so reflected in the press and movies. And we have just received a clear confirmation of this. Mocked, killed the commander, leaving him without help after being wounded. Is this not beastliness? And now I'm walking down long corridors, behind me a giant in a black uniform with a red star on his cap. Fear begins to penetrate every pore of my body. What if they shoot me? We enter the room. There sits an officer not in naval uniform and another man in civilian clothes. They ask us to sit down. The man in civilian clothes is an interpreter. He speaks German with a stutter and a terrible accent. I understand his questions. I answer slowly, in the manner of a radio announcer, and he understands me. The officer asks, the interpreter translates, I answer in German, the interpreter translates again, and the officer writes and writes. This ritual goes on for a long time, until all these lies invented on the boat are written down. They let me sign it. How can I sign? I have no idea what it says. The interpreter translates the text of the interrogation from Russian into German. I think it's a lie anyway. I can sign it, so I did. The sailor returned me to my former residence. A woman brought dinner, a piece of bread, a mug of hot water, and a plate with a hot, yellow, granular mass, from which comes an unusual and unpleasant odor, which does not arouse appetite. I force myself to eat, but the smell and taste of millet porridge is disgusting, so that I could not bear it in captivity for a long time. I lie down on a cozy sofa and instantly fall asleep. The treatment of the officer and interpreter was so human that the mental overstrain of the last 24 hours weakened, and the soul found oblivion in sleep. I wake up from the alarm. Shots of anti-aircraft guns are heard. A familiar sailor shouts and pushes me forward. I think of being shot in the basement, that's how they showed it in the movies. But I hear the familiar sound of engines. It's ours bombing Astrakhan. My God, now we are finished, they will take revenge for the victims of the bombing. In the basement there is a large hall full of people in uniform, men, women and children. I see a pilot and a mechanic. I join them. The Russians are trying to make conversation with us. The sailor, smiling, hands a piece of newsprint. I make it clear that I don't understand. Then he starts to twist this scrap, putting a mahorka on it, molded, and offers me this casing to glue with saliva. To my luck, the pilot has some experience and explains in detail what should be done. That's how I smoked mahorka for the first time under the explosions of bombs, which were dropped on us by the remaining comrades of Squadron No. 100. I had not smoked at all before, but since then I smoked mahorka continuously for 6 years. When I returned home, I could not get used to the cigarettes of that time. I continued to smoke mahorka, which I bought from the Soviet military. I had to give up the mahorka, however, because the odor of smoke, unfamiliar to the Germans, began to repel people from me. The rest of the night passed, and in the morning I was interrogated again. The same picture, the same questions, not the slightest deviation from yesterday's program. In the rest room, the only entertainment was to look out the window. In the evening I was summoned again, this time by a different route. Together with the investigator and the interpreter, we drive around the city in the same Z's, stop in front of a large building, go down the stairs and corridors to a large hall. Strange picture. The tables are arranged in a letter P with a length of 10 meters. They are covered with green tablecloths, on them carafes with water. And at the tables sit people 30 to 40 in different uniforms with epaulettes. In the middle, there is a narrow nightstand, where I am offered to sit down. What is this? A trial. Are they going to cross-examine me? But everything is overridden by the thought, will there be a death sentence now? The interpreter takes a seat near the impressive figure of a high-ranking officer with wide golden epaulettes, and the interrogation begins. The interpreter stutters even more from the sense of responsibility. I do not understand him more and more often, and then others begin to ask questions. Well, finally my mind clears. They're trying to confuse me and get me to contradict the protocols from the interrogations before. The tension eases and I start playing my game. The interpreter gets confused because I understand his questions worse and worse. This fun continues for more than an hour, and the mood of the interrogators becomes more and more unfriendly. I told them all the same things we had agreed on the boat, so I was calm. My testimony could not contradict the text of the protocols. Then I was taken again to the commandant's office, and what a surprise, in my room there was a pilot and a mechanic. They had gone through all this interrogation before me, and apparently there were no discrepancies in their testimony, so they allowed the crew to reunite. The night passed quietly. The morning greeted with sunshine, The old woman brought us breakfast, and our mood improved. The pilot taught to recognize ranks by epaulettes, and said that the main in yesterday's performance was a general. Suddenly a sailor appeared and told me to follow him into a familiar interrogation room. I see a new officer, a major. Now I can see the stars. In appearance he looks like a representative of academic intelligentsia. He greets me in pure German, and a conversation begins that has nothing to do with interrogation. About family background, about German history and culture. He is interested in my education, and after learning that I have studied English, he switches to it without difficulty, treats me to white bread, fish and a shot of vodka. I relax too. And so on for over an hour. Suddenly the major says, "Mr. Fieldfebel, I have the impression that you have a good education and a high level of intelligence. I would like to know why you think Russians are fools. According to the interrogation reports, you lied to us. Now I'll tell you what happened. You didn't fly from Kerch, but from Stalino to mine the Volga. Your Commander Major Class is well known to us. I regret that he died." Well, if he knows everything, why does he ask? It becomes clear to me that our mines cause great harm to navigation on the Volga. But the principle of action of German mines has not yet been revealed, and they hope that they can get the relevant information from us. But, thank God, we know nothing about it. The principle of action of these mines is a secret of specialized personnel of the airfield, and the flight personnel have been trained only to drop mines from an insignificant height in the fairway of the riverbed. And the handsome major is convinced that we are not able to reveal this secret to him. All the more offensive to him that the drunken captain of the fishing boat killed a crew member who probably knew more about mines than the sergeants and privates. That's why they put that captain on trial, I guess. We say goodbye to the major as to an old and good acquaintance. He spends the last hour with us together, and finally asks if there are any complaints or wishes. It turns out that we were deprived of a watch, and there is a desire to see the city of Astrakhan before leaving for the camp. The latter must be considered pure insolence, but both are answered in the affirmative. It is difficult to express the gratitude that we felt and still feel to that major. He treated us humanly, rather like a knight respecting the enemy. The position of prisoner of war was no longer so frightening. The citizens, sailors and officers in the Astrakhan commandant's office gave proof of what the late commander had said, advising us not to resort to suicide. We were entering the unfamiliar world of the Soviet country. It seemed that the deadly threat had receded, fate had given us life, so there was a future. The wristwatch was kept by the camp chief until I got to Stalingrad, where I exchanged it with the Russian supply chief for a liter of millet porridge with vegetable oil. 3 German pilots in military uniform and a sailor of the Caspian fleet with a machine gun on his shoulder went to the city to see the sights of Astrakhan. And for the people of the city, the most amazing thing was us. Soon we were surrounded by a curious crowd of people. There was no anger or hatred on their faces, but interest and curiosity, so we didn't even think that the crowd could pose a threat to us. True, one disabled man on crutches was shouting something and threatening us with his fist. It was a strange experience. It was from that moment that a kind of re-education began. New points were raised about the veracity of our Nazi propaganda. The convoyer became nervous, led us to the streetcar stop, cleared the second carriage of passengers. We got on and rode through the city to an empty sandy spot where a large school-type building stood. This was the first time we got acquainted with the design of the special structures of the Soviet prisoner of war camps, saw the gatehouses and towers. It was not a school, but a hospital. We were given beds with mattresses, sheets and blankets. In a large hall with 100 beds there were no more than 10 people. We were looked at with disbelief. Where did such healthy men in clean uniforms come from? Maybe they put up informers. They answered questions reluctantly. They don't talk about their sufferings at all. About the events of the march of the column of prisoners from Stalingrad to Astrakhan too. We learned about it later, from the survivors in the production camp. We are all lying on our bunks and waiting for food to be brought. Boring to the point of disgust. We had plenty to eat. I have no special memories. For the first time I saw Caspian herring salty fat with a wide back and nut flavor. I greedily ate a portion and did not know how to quench my thirst. The smell of millet porridge still disgusted me, but it could be exchanged for bread, soup, or fish. We had not been here long. An officer came in, and one of the prisoners translated his apologetic-looking speech to us. "We have a hospital here for the sick and convalescent. You are healthy people, and unfortunately I can't feed you anymore. Tomorrow you will go by car to the production camp." We were not upset. The next day we got acquainted for the first time with the half-truck, in the back of which we set off on our way to the south. The Tabala camp was located directly on the bank of the main channel of the Volga River in its delta. The camp area is fenced with barbed wire only on land. Access to the water is free. There are 4 buildings in the zone: a large log house with a large and single room where 100 Romanians live, 2 booths made of boards, each with bunks for 8 people in them live the Germans, to whom we now join. In addition, there is a smaller log house with a kitchen, dining room, and infirmary. The booths are made of bare boards, so that there is constant blowing through the gaps and window openings. There is no glass in the windows, but only gauze, which is supposed to prevent mosquitoes from getting in. But their numbers in the booths are proof that the effectiveness of the gauze is 0. The only way to protect against these unwanted guests is to smoke the booth in the evening with smouldering dried cow and camel dung. From the sharp smoke you can suffocate yourself rather than mosquitoes. The onslaught of their hordes subsides only with the arrival of the morning chill. The bunks are covered with thin reeds and sheets. The latter are intended to protect the body from mosquitoes and keep warm. There are no blankets. The climate in this region of the Volga is very unbalanced. To the west of us there are swamps, to the east dry steppe. The wind direction changes 5 times a day. Air humidity is extremely high or unusually low. The temperature in the middle of the day rises to 40 degrees, and early in the morning it drops to 10 degrees before sunrise. It turns out that during the day we suffer from heat and mosquitoes in the evening, and at night we freeze. In the load, unaccustomed to such a climate, the body is large. Adaptation is slow, and I have symptoms of circulatory disorders. Most of the prisoners work on collective farm fields where they grow tomatoes, melons, watermelons, cucumbers, and cabbage. The strongest and healthiest of the Romanians do the hard work of shore fishermen. They throw long nets into the sea and then pull them ashore. Sometimes beluga and red fish are caught in the nets. Those who work in the field go to work at 6 a.m., lunch break from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., second day off at 4 p.m., dinner at 8 p.m. A long lunch break is necessary because it is impossible to work in the fields in the open sun in the middle of the day. We pilots are attached to the agrarian brigade, and on the second day after arrival we stand in the line. The roster is small, 115 people, and the so-called check when going to work is not too burdensome to the officer on duty. With a counting board in his hands, he quickly copes with it in a matter of minutes. What suffering the check can bring, we learned later. The prisoners who arrived in Astrakhan in the middle of March, after a terrible march along the Volga from Stalingrad, look healthy. Then 5,000 people set off on the way, no more than 200 survived, and those in the hospital. Stories about their sufferings, their experiences, first in unequal battles in the encirclement, then on the way to the south, should be the subject of a special chronicle. I do not want to retell them. It is very hard, and I was not an eyewitness of those events. It is difficult to understand what people do to people. And what should the Russians have done? The terrible battle for Stalingrad ate up the last reserves of both military and food material and personnel, even on the side of the winner, the Red Army. And then suddenly the combat units are tasked with housing, treating and feeding almost 100,000 prisoners of war, whose physical condition is catastrophic. The unfortunate crowd of German soldiers suffered in the Stalingrad encirclement from rampant typhus and lice, from hunger and cold. A minimum level of hygiene was lacking. After the surrender of the Sixth Army, they tried to distribute them to areas that had not yet had to experience the ravages of combat. But all this took place in February-March, during the harshest period of the Russian winter. Every day the prisoners had to walk 20 to 30 kilometers without food, in clothes not designed for winter, to sleep under the clear sky, and at the same time to wage a senseless struggle with thousands of lice. To walk 20 to 30 kilometers with no prospect for improvement, every day hearing the gunshots of convoys who finish off those who are no longer able to walk. Who can bear such physical and psychological strain? It must be considered a miracle that anyone survived at all. The social composition of the surviving Germans could be cited as proof that war is a process of negative selection. The honest and intellectual have less chances of surviving than the rough and brutal. This explains why, of the 13 German Stalingraders in the camp, not one of them belonged to the intelligentsia. Accordingly, we are dealing with the kind of people who find means of preserving their own lives in any environment, without feeling feelings like shame, and when these means are clearly applied at the expense of a more or less similarly compassionate person. The will to preserve one's own life, as it comes out of the above, broke through even the emotional barrier to cannibalism. How can one believe in a good God in such an environment? I don't feel good in the company of this small group of Germans. On the one hand, they like to see our fear, with which we listen to their stories about their experiences, and on the other hand, they are cautious, afraid of close contact with us. We pilots remain strangers to them, and communication with Romanians is also at zero. Lieutenant Meyer, the political officer of the camp, had a great influence on my mental and spiritual state. I was surprised to hear him address me in pure German. There is no doubt that he grew up in Germany. The manner of address testifies to a high level of education and intelligence. The first, as if by chance, conversations took place on topics far from politics. We discussed questions of philosophy, which I was fond of before joining the Air Force. He always formulates interestingly, brings interesting arguments. I enjoy arguing with him. After work and dinner in the evening, we sit with him on a bench on the bank of the Volga River and talk like old acquaintances. My thoughts do not leave me even while working in the field. I try to determine my position in the dispute and prepare new arguments. The usual evening conversations are interrupted for a while. I got a sunstroke. While working in the field, I fell unconscious. I was carried to the camp, where I met a young woman, the camp doctor. She placed me in the medical station and took great care of my health. What medicines and means she treated me with, I forget. I remember that I was lying alone in a small room, and my comrades brought me food, not without hope that the sick person would not want to eat. This often happened. Often the doctor would come to me and try to talk to me. Her knowledge of English and German was deplorable, i.e., communication between us was at a rather low level. The level could rise only in the presence of political officer Meyer, and this, as it seemed to me, did not like Tamara Nikolaevna, as she was called. Meyer too much determined the topic of conversation according to his own considerations, which did not seem to correspond to the woman's wishes. I recovered quickly, and the duty officer demanded that I go to work. This took place in the presence of Meyer and Bagrova TNN, and they did not consent to it. We need a sanitary worker in the camp. Do you have even the slightest medical education? Of course I do, I answered with full confidence, since my mother in her native village held courses in first aid, and I often helped her demonstrate various techniques. So I became an orderly and continued to sleep in the medical station. Thus began my career as a physician's assistant. I knew that among the old staff there was a military orderly, more trained, and why they chose me, then I did not know. And the reasons, as it turned out later, were different for both guardians. At this point, I interrupt the chronology of events to tell you about something else. The camp is 20 kilometers from Astrakhan, and the closest polyclinic is in the city. It served the residents of Astrakhan and the population of the suburban sites. To serve the German prisoners in the camp had to allocate medical personnel, while due to the shortage of doctors at the front died their wounded without medical care. It was not uncommon for citizens from the village of Tabala to come to the camp's infirmary requesting treatment. I participated in such receptions and later provided therapeutic assistance also in the absence of a doctor. Meyer's visits became more frequent. The workload of the orderly was not heavy. While the brigades worked, it was necessary to mop the floor, clean the dishes, keep order in the infirmary and take care of the sick, if there were any. There was plenty of free time for conversations. The subject matter was shifting more and more to political ideologies, which I didn't like very much. Why? Because Meyer could dance on that parquet much better than I could. The opposing ideologies were the ideology of the Nazi state and historical and dialectical materialism. Meyer, as I later learned, was a pedagogue and was perfectly able to manipulate the students' persuasion techniques. Relatively quickly, I realized that Hitler's teachings were limited to boundless nationalism, overestimation of the merits of the German race, and underestimation of any other peoples, aggressiveness, the Germans' claim to colonies and occupation of the countries of their eastern neighbors. I consider Meyer's merit to be his ability to contrast this vague ideology with the strict logic of Engels' teachings. A man of sound mind should recognize the superiority in preaching the friendship of all people in the world over the chaotic tirades of hatred and robber ideology. Of course, Meyer could not turn me into a fighter for Marxism-communism in a few weeks, but he aroused my curiosity to learn more about this worldview. In August, Meyer brought a German-language newspaper, Free Germany, with pictures of German senior generals and officers who, together with German émigrés, had founded the National Committee of Free Germany, and were calling on German prisoners to resist Hitler and declare the oath they had taken to him null and void. We did not really believe that the highest officers of the Wehrmacht could join the revolt against Hitler's Germany because they support the Russians, our enemy. And then the desire to get acquainted with an unknown ideology clashed with the honor of a soldier. If Meyer is going to turn me into an enemy of my own people, then with all this must be uncompromisingly ended and no longer communicate with him. But he clung to me and psychologically very cleverly broke the barrier that I tried to ward him off no harm to anyone if you know the theoretical ideologies of the enemy. You'll just become more competent in everything. In this sense, the processing continued, and finally the politician suggested studying the course of the anti-fascist school. That's where the interests of Lieutenant Meyer, head of the political department, were directed. I agreed. The interests of the doctor, Tamara Nikolaevna, were far from politics. There was a personal interest here. At first, there was just a humane attitude. She brought me a Russian language textbook for Germans and a Russian-German dictionary, organized my work so that I had time to study Russian. I took up my studies with zeal. And if to it to add frequent conversations with me in Russian, it was a connection between theory and practice. Slowly but slowly things progressed. In a month I was already translating articles from Pravda, military bulletins, where there was a limited stock of frequently repeated words. Lieutenant Meyer acted as a teacher and proofreader of my translations, which the doctor did not like. It allegedly interfered with my studies. July and August were devoted to mastering conversational speech, and the only partner was Tamara Nikolaevna. The topics of conversation gradually moved into the emotional sphere, and at the same time helped in the medical direction. There were few medicines: charcoal tablets for dysentery, greenery for disinfecting wounds, black ointment for ulcers, acrikine and quinine for malaria. The doctor received the sick, and I was taught to diagnose. Then I began to trust the treatment as well. Med school at the university could not have been more effective. One day she disappeared for a whole week and I found myself in a difficult position. It's night. Everyone is asleep, including me. I'm awakened by a shout, "Mister." Orderly, I don't immediately realize that the gentleman is me. The senior Romanian explains that one of his comrades is dying. The rest of the Romanians ask to hurry. We entered the building, and in the light of a candle I see a sick man who is convulsing on his bed. With my hand I determine that the temperature is very high. The diagnosis is simple: an attack of tropical malaria. What do I do? I already know how to make an intramuscular injection. The doctor showed me how to make a shot on the border between the back and the ass. My eldest is begging for help. I went to the nurse's station, got a disinfected syringe, an ampoule of quinine, and returning, asked the strong assistants to hold the patient to ensure immobility. Literally 10 minutes after the injection, the patient calmed down and fell asleep. What a miracle! The next day he was weak, but he was feeling fine. There were a few more weak attacks before the doctor came, and then they stopped. And here is what surprised me. In the morning, the officer on duty comes to me with a question: "How many inoperable people do you have?" I count on my fingers and answer. The lieutenant thanks me, salutes, and leaves. It's already hard to understand. He is, in fact, my jailer, but he treats me as an equal. But he was in the war, he was severely wounded, he has no right arm, i.e., he became disabled as a result of combat operations. I am a representative of the enemy who came to his land. Just do not understand. The duty position of camp doctor on duty I had to fulfill several times, and as fate decided, 2 more cases of complicated and emergency medical care fell on me. My second emergency patient was again a Romanian. A fight broke out on the field, during which one fought back against the other with a knife to the face. There was a 10-centimeter long cut wound on his cheek, and there was no doctor. We called Political Officer Meyer, and he decided that the wound should be stitched up immediately, as there was no transportation to Astrakhan, so there was nowhere to wait for help. He got some red threads, and I took the necessary tools from the medical station. And again I was lucky I was already present at such an operation when Tamara Nikolaevna sewed up a villager's leg. There were no painkillers, but there were strong men to ensure immobility of the victim. 3 assistants held the patient sitting on a chair, and I had to place 7 stitches under the howling of the martyr. At the end of this torture, my well-being was deplorable. I am sure the patient felt much better than I did, but I was very flattered that from that day on the Romanians began to call me Mr. Doctor. A year later, in Camp No. 165 Talitsi, I was recognized by the very Romanian whom I had treated for an attack of malaria. He summoned his compatriots and introduced me as a savior from death. Several times he supplied me with food as a token of his gratitude, but where he got it I do not know. When Tamara Nikolaevna appeared after my examination for a surgeon on the 3rd day, we were horrified to learn that the patient had cut the knots of thread with a razor. Fortunately, there were no complications. The 3rd patient was a German, very close to me, whose hand swelled right before my eyes more and more from an unknown inflammation. The danger of blood poisoning was great. Again the council, headed by Meyer, convened, and again all the responsibility fell on me. I was terribly worried. I must inflict sharp pain on my friend to save him from death. A medical man could determine what was wrong with him and whether he needed surgery. And what am I? A helpless amateur. I tried to postpone the term of intervention until the doctor, but she did not come, and on the hand showed a large yellow spot pus. Under the supervision of my superiors, I managed to open the focus of inflammation, remove the pus, and free my comrade from pain and complications. No one paid attention to me, and I was terribly nauseous, my knees were shaking, chills ran down my back, and one thing became clear to me: I will never be a doctor. Friendly relations with both Maya and Tamara Nikolaevna moved to an even higher level when I fell ill with jaundice. The pain in the liver area was severe and I had to lie in bed. There was no appetite. The only thing I wanted to eat was the herring and tomatoes that Romanian man brought me. But the doctor must not have known about this, because she forbade eating any food containing salt and spices. On this ground, the doctor and Maya started a competition. They started bringing me delicacies. For the first time in my life, I tasted black caviar, which was canned in a small factory near our camp. Maya brought the caviar with white bread and cucumber. When the doctor found out about it, she almost burst with anger. If he brings more, throw it into the Volga, he will poison you. I do not remember what exactly she brought in exchange for Maya's gift, but I remember well that during this period I had an abundance of delicacies and gave the extra food to my comrades. I was cured quite quickly. Russian language classes resumed, conversations with Maya in German and with the doctor in Russian continued. My conversational speech improved from day to day, and I understood almost everything. In any case, I understood the meaning of the speech. But fate had prepared a special porridge for me. In the evening after work, Tamara Nikolaevna and I were sitting in the nurse's station, she at the desk and I opposite, and we looked into each other's eyes. She apparently decided that I already knew enough Russian to allow us to communicate on a heart-to-heart level. And I, unfortunately, was not prepared for such subtle topics. Just by my general psychological state, though I understood the meaning of her words, she asked me, "Kolya, do you love me?" It is quite easy to find an answer to such a question. She treated me as a good friend, but I decided to raise my grade. I answer, yes, like my own mother. I'll never forget the explosion of disgust and amazement on her face. Her eyes, which had just radiated kindness, turned black and threw lightning bolts of anger. She got up and walked out without a word, and I sat there wondering what crime I had committed. She was older than me by 5 or 7 years. Her appearance did not inspire me, and the transition from the position of a pilot to a slave I had not yet felt, did not understand. Maybe everything happened for the best, because close ties between personnel and prisoners were punished very strictly at that time. But I got my no in full. The consequences of the conversation were quickly felt. I learned firsthand what a woman's bullying was. Tamara Nikolaevna began to address me as you, scolded me as soon as she could. All day long I had to clean everything from top to bottom, and when I finished I had to start all over again. How happy I was when I learned interesting news from Maya. Future cadets of the anti-fascist school are going to the Central Camp Section 1081 in Stalingrad. The other day you will go there by steamer. What a joy! I did not realize at that time that I would get out of the fire and into the fire. Here in Tabala, it was a village idyll in comparison with other camps. We were fed to the full, no one pushed anyone to work, we were all decently dressed, we were treated humanly, even with a friendly touch, we felt respect even for our enemy prisoners. It is worth remembering how we spent our non-working time on the bank of the Volga. Access to the bank was open, i.e., there was no fence. We built there a platform of planks where we rinsed kettles and kitchen utensils. On the bottom of the river there were food remains, which attracted small fish, black-eyed fish. Among the Romanians there were several gypsies who taught us how to fish with a fishing rod, the hook of which was made of a pin. We used bread crumbs as bait. Fish seemed to hunt for this bait, as a result of which experienced fishermen managed to catch 20 to 30 pieces per hour. Of course, nobody wanted to eat this fish raw, so on the shore we lit small fires and cooked soup or puffed dish of fish and tomatoes. In the evenings we sat around the fires and eating, talked. None of the chiefs bothered us. It was forbidden to swim, but no one passionately followed the fulfillment of this order. Therefore, after the evening inspection, we went swimming in the Volga. There was not enough wood for a fire. Cauldrons in the kitchen were stoked with dry plant residues, which were collected in the steppe. For firewood we went out on a camel, of course, without a convoy. 3 or 4 prisoners of war on a cart with a camel in harness would leave in the morning and return in the evening. There was enough for the kitchen and for our fires. Fuel was exchanged for food and tobacco. One day in August, Lieutenant Meyer came to me. "Can you mow hay?" "I know how." "Do you want to go haymaking?" "I do." "You'll go to the nearest wharf. There's a man with a beard waiting for you in a boat. You'll help him, and he'll feed you." I went with pleasure, found the man, sat down with him in the boat. I explained that I could row, and we went to the opposite shore. What a joy to float calmly on the water, to admire from below the sides of barges and ships, which towered 10 meters and more. The weather was fine, my mood was good too. I tried to show the man how well I could row. He himself is a handsome man, with a cheerful gleam in his eyes, and most importantly, he looks at me as an ordinary man, without any hostility. We pulled the boat to the shore and started mowing. Again I had a chance to show my strength and skill. I did not lag behind the man neither in speed, nor in width of swing. We walked together across the meadow like an experienced pair of mowers. I wanted to earn this man's praise. I didn't want to talk and think about war, about hatred, about bad things. Those were wonderful hours in the life of a free man. It was time for lunch. The man gave me what he had, black bread with fresh milk. So much for pleasure. The taste remained in my memory forever. No matter how many times I tried to taste this heavenly flavor after a pleasant job, it was useless. The work was finished, came back, and the man shook my hand in gratitude. Time, how pleasant you can be even in captivity. Before I begin to describe the upheaval in my life and the move from the paradisiacal camp in Turbulent to the hellish environment of the camp in Krasnoarmeysk, I would like to tell you about the change in my life. Krasnoarmeysk, I want to tell you about the concepts of paradise and hell for a prisoner of war. The physical and psychological condition depends on the following factors: the political and ideological attitude of the government towards the POWs, the standard of living of the population living nearby, ration rates, discipline and honesty of the supervising personnel, the type of labor performed by the prisoners, the ability to obtain food in addition to rations. As for the Turbulent camp, on Factor 1 everything was in order. The legal norms regarding German prisoners were followed, according to Stalin's orders. On Factor 2 the population did not starve. Fishing and growing vegetables guaranteed food for everyone, so there was no negative impact on the prisoners. On Factor 3 the situation is strange. The top leadership apparently decided to keep 150 to 200 German Stalingraders who survived in mandatory health. The norm was overestimated for literally everyone, as for dystrophics, although there were no such people. On Factor No. 4 a high level of discipline and self-discipline prevailed, lawfulness was observed. And this is Meyer's merit. He personally controlled the issuance and stocking of food in the kitchen. He did not allow stealing food on the side or by blat. The food that the prisoners received was very close to the ration. In the morning, half a kilo of porridge of different kinds of cereals with sunflower oil and 200 grams of bread. Bread at lunch, 3 meals, 1 liter of soup with mutton or fish, half a kilo of porridge, 200 g. of bread and compote from dry bread. Bread and compote from dried fruits. For dinner again 1 liter of soup and bread. Those who brought products were enriched, obviously, with fish from our catch. On Factor No. 5 working conditions were tolerable. The convoyer's words, come on, were heard just out of habit. On Factor 6 the situation at Camp Turbulent was perfect. Vegetables and fruits were brought from the fields in pockets and bags, and the Volga River was teeming with fish. If we simplify everything and imagine satiety as paradise, then yes, the camp in the village of Turbulent was a paradise for the prisoners. They were not exhausted, and therefore were not exposed to such diseases as dysentery, pneumonia, typhus, severe edema, i.e., diseases that are disastrous for a person without physical and mental reserves. When I went to Stalingrad, my naivety had not yet left me. I was glad to be rid of Tamara Nikolaevna's psychotorturer, and did not guess that the transition to another camp would be like an exile from paradise. Especially since the way from Astrakhan to Stalingrad was like a trip to a resort. And another miracle at parting Maya gave me a wristwatch, which had been taken away when I was taken prisoner. And here is the difference: in Tabala the watch was returned to me, but in Krasnoarmeysk it could not have occurred to the supervising personnel that there were such fools who could return something to a prisoner. I have already told above how I exchanged my watch for porridge with sunflower oil. Another surprise was transportation to Stalingrad. I am travelling with a convoyer on a steamer. He carries a bulky bag with food, and I a prisoner walk without a burden, just madness of some kind. September 28th, 1943. 2 of us are going to Astrakhan in a semi-truck. For the first time I see the river station, where people with various luggage are crowded waiting for the steamer. I admire the exotic picture to a certain extent. I look at the unusual for a German mixture of representatives of different nationalities. Hair from blonde to dark black, eyes from round to almond oval, noses blunt and long, straight and curved, clothes colourful and unremarkable. And I am standing in the uniform of a German Air Force pilot, and no one pays attention to it. I try to find expressions of anger, hostility and hatred on their faces, but without success. The mass of people dissolves me into itself. Suddenly the inevitable news the steamer is coming spreads from mouth to mouth to mouth. The crowd moves toward the gangway, which as yet still lies on the wharf. Slowly and majestically approaching is a steamer of a size not to be found on the rivers of Germany. This picture makes a deep impression on me, and I forget again that I am in captivity. I absorb what I've seen and put it into my memory. The passengers on the gangway collapse onto the steamer. The escort and I swim in the stream of living creatures, which, bypassing the narrowing of the gangway, spills over the decks. The escort knows where to move, and we take a comfortable place in some passage. Thus began an unforgettable trip. To this day I marvel at the majesty of the Mother Volga and the nature of its shores. I was allowed to move freely on board. I stand on the upper deck, admire the church and the steep cliff of the Black Yar, the width of the plain in the east, and stumble with my eyes at the sunken barges near the fairway. This is the result of our minds, I think, looking around apprehensively, as if no one would pick on me. But everyone, on the contrary, turns quite normally with questions. Who are you? Are you German? German. A prisoner of war? Of course. And how and where did you get captured? A whole story follows. Are your parents alive? They are. Do you have a wife and children? No, straight out of school and into the army. Hitler kaput, soon to go home. I first heard this stereotype home soon on this boat. But this good wish followed us prisoners of war all the way through the captivity until its realization. Would an evil enemy who had in his head the hardened wish-dyed German bastard wish soon home? No. Soon home, and before me lay 6 long years of captivity. But I never forgot that many Russians kept in their souls the wish that I should live to return home. These 2 words I did not take as empty consolation, but to me they remained forever an expression of the good-naturedness and humanity of most Russian people. If home soon, it means that one should not give in to pessimism. One should look forward to a bright future, actively coping with the difficulties of the situation. Thank you to those who told me home soon. From the bag, the escort pulls out surprises: bread, lard, cheese, concentrates. We boiled porridge, 8 from 1 pot. Have you had enough? I'm full. Do you want bread and lard? Yes, thank you. When the steamer docks, he asks me to be near it. So, in perfect weather, that unforgettable voyage on the Volga passes. I leave the steamer in admiration. I would sooner be in the camp and go to the anti-fascist school. By my naivety, I imagined the upcoming events in the camp near Stalingrad as follows. In this camp, I will be met by a cheerful group of future cadets who are physically and morally similar to me. We will gather there, get acquainted, and in a couple of days we will go to the north. To the anti-fascist school. With this picture before my eyes, I passed the passageway of that camp, in which in fact I was to receive the basic hardening of a prisoner of war. The officer on duty who received me saw to it that I was given dinner in the kitchen. First impression, I thought, is positive. But immediately I was shocked. Dinner consisted of a piece of salted fish the size of my thumb and a mug of hot water. When I asked whether soup and bread were given, the cook laughed and explained that bread was given only in the morning and soup only at lunchtime. As I had to see in time, the feeding here was not for the purpose of keeping the prisoners alive. About the first factor there were only some rumours from afar. Besides, there is a proverb, Russia is great, the Tsar is far away. As for the second factor, the local population was starving. The living standard of people was extremely low. As for the third factor, the ration, neither the prisoners nor the command staff had any idea what it was. It was difficult for us to determine the condition of the third factor. It was possible to find out only after the entire staff had been replaced and, as we were assured, transferred to the front. The theft of products quantitatively decreased several times after this purge. It is worth emphasizing the fact that certain circles of German and Romanian GPS contributed to the squandering of food resources, personally having a certain benefit. Working conditions were hard, but still bearable. On factor 6, the chances were negligible. I will tell about some ways of extra food extraction below. Exhausted people died mainly from dysentery and infectious diseases. This was the situation in the detention center 1081 in Krasnoarmeysk when I arrived there on November 1st, 1943. I arrived there healthy, physically strong, dressed in a new uniform, and utterly naive about what awaited me. In short, I caught the eye of those who suffered and those who governed. My abnormal appearance first influenced the top German superiors. I was placed in a small room where my neighbors were two sergeants from Upper Silesia who spoke only Polish to each other in my presence. They were afraid of the snitch and did everything to force me out of this privileged dwelling. There was still no talk of going out to work, but there were no future cadets in sight either. No one from the political unit approached me, and with the given rations it was boring and burdensome to loiter in the camp area. By chance I met the pilot of one crew of my squadron, who had been shot down over the Soviet rear before my arrival at the front. As foreman of the electrical shop at the Rembaza, he invited me to join his crew with the prospect of an increased bread ration. The Rembaza was a large workshop on the territory of the Red Army shipyard, where exclusively German prisoners of war repaired purely German tanks, delivered there by heavy Caterpillar tractors from the battlefield from Stalingrad. The tanks were trophy tanks of various degrees of damage. They were dismantled down to the last screw, and usable parts were sent to the assembly line, where operable combat vehicles were assembled. The technical management of this assembly plant rested on the shoulders of some German specialists who, before being called up to the army, had done the same work at the Krupp tank factory in the Ruhr region of Germany. To be employed in the Rembase was considered somewhat of a privilege. All team members were specialists, and the daily ration of bread was measured on merit 1,000 grams. As for my practical skills in electrical engineering, one could speak of a pure white spot. In gymnasium I hated this subject and hardly kept on the grade enough. My success in mechanics, on the other hand, was graded quite well. Brigadier Ernst Hepp needed a mechanic to repair gasoline pumps, and this job was to my liking. I did it quickly, and the Russian foreman was pleased with me. The production of tanks was divided into two main parts: assembly line and special workshops for preparation and storage of parts and units for assembly. The labor rate for the special workshops was not very terrible. Each specialist was assigned certain parts and assemblies, 3 sets of which in a suitable condition for the conveyor he had to store in the warehouse. At the end of the shift, the foreman checked the warehouse of the assembly shop. He found 3 sets there he gave 100%, thus providing the specialist with a kilogram of bread. Often the conveyor stopped because it was not possible to feed some unit. This meant for the rest of the special workshops no more products, i.e., no more idle work. However, it was never idle. On such days they made various common goods to sell to the Russians for bread and lard. Winter came with frost. A large conveyor shop was heated with oil, which was poured into an open tank about 3 × 2 meters in size. The black smoke rose to the roof of the building, thickened there, and descended in the downward currents of air circulation in the form of black flakes. This black substance adhered to both clothing and the exposed surfaces of human skin. Any objects were covered with the black ointment, making the prisoners working in the repair shop look like Negroes. In mid-November, the water supply in the camp was cut off. There was no well in the camp. Water for the kitchen was brought in cisterns. The bathhouse stopped working, and the only means of removing this black deposit from the human body was gasoline. It was relatively easy to get gasoline in the Rembaza, and none of the supervising personnel looked at the daily process of filling canisters and bottles with gasoline to clean the face and hands. The side effects of such hygiene were not long in coming: degreasing of the skin, formation of cracks, inflammations, and the appearance of ulcers. Even worse were the results from the inactivity of baths and disinfection, outbreaks of pediculosis. The saying "Nicht wir haben Layers, die Layers haben uns" was heard more and more often. I don't know if the translation matches the meaning of the German phrase, but the gist of the matter is that millions of lice will soon drag us wherever they want to go. It's not uncommon to sit around in the evening looking for lice in our clothes, really not looking for them, but collecting them. There is a competition to see who has more success. Before the main hunt begins, we put our hand under the arm, clench our fist, bring it close to the light and open it. The champion is the one with the highest number of lice captured. Looking for lice is an activity that can only be successful if there is sufficient light. But there is no time to do it during the day, and it is dark in the evening. There is no electricity in the housing units. Again we see the truth in the old proverb, the wisecrackers, 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 wisecracker. The rooms in the housing are illuminated by an open flame, and each resident has a flame. Lamps are made in the following way. The tank for fuel is a cut-off 10-centimeter casing of 88mm anti-aircraft shell, which, thanks to the thick and accordingly heavy bottom, stands firmly on the table. From the tin of a tin can at the Rembaza make a lid with a hole with the diameter of a rifle cartridge, and into the hole soldered a section of such a cartridge. The wick is a wick made of cotton fibers extracted from cotton jackets and pants. One should imagine a picture of daily hunting in a room of about 4 × 4 meters. One half is occupied by bunk beds for 16 people. The other half is occupied by a table of about 1.5 × 0.8 meters and a bench. The 16 inhabitants are resting picturesquely on the bunks and on the bench, each with a gasoline lamp in front of him. The upper part of the hero's body, underpants and t-shirts, are kept close to the flame. Lice are collected and placed on the hot lid of the lamp, where they burst with acoustic recoil. The number of shootings can be determined with closed eyes, and experts determine the age of the lice by the volume of the sound. It is only a pity that the level of illumination does not allow to destroy young generations of these terrible insects. They are not visible, and sexual maturity of young people comes at the stage of their invisibility in these lighting conditions. It should be taken into account that it is cold in the wild. The window is not opened. Exhaust gases from 16 lamps enrich the atmosphere in the room, mixing with transpiration products of 16 dirty and smelly inhabitants. It would seem impossible to sleep under such conditions. But human beings have amazing abilities to endure extreme stresses. It is quite incomprehensible how, in this cramped prison cell, there was never a single instance of the homemade gasoline lamps toppling over. If it had happened, no casualties could have been avoided. At the joint evening gatherings in the cell itself I took part, but I was unable to sleep in my assigned place. The cause was not the poisoned atmosphere, but bedbugs, which competed with lice in numbers. For about 2.5 months I slept in the cold corridor, lying instead of a mattress on a cotton jacket and covering myself with a military overcoat. I curled up like a snail and froze like a dog, but I slept and froze without the greedy bites of bedbugs, who valued the taste of my blood very highly. One tries to lie on the bunk, as in a minute one sees the onset of this yoke of mankind from all sides. They tend to those parts of the body where the skin is thinner and the veins are close to the surface. In a matter of minutes, these areas are covered with blisters. The only way out is to keep a sufficient distance from the bunk. I am very jealous of the fact that someone can sleep in this zoo without suffering.